The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. Welcome to NACOL's webinar today, Civilian Oversight 101. We recently have had, I think, Liana, you recently said over 75 communities have recently contacted us wanting more information about civilian oversight. And so NACOL decided that it would be a great idea to put together something so that people could have some of the most basic information about civilian oversight of law enforcement. So Liana and I have put together a few slides today, are hoping to present about 40 minutes of information to all of you, and then leave about 20 minutes for some questions and answers. We'll also leave you with our email addresses at the end so that if you have any questions following our presentation that we might not get to, that we can follow up with you or you can follow up with us with your questions. Just a couple of housekeeping items. You have all entered the webinar in listen-only mode because we have about 115 people signed up for the webinar today. When you have a question, if you could please just type your question in, then Liana or I will, if it's a housekeeping question, just some problems with connectivity, we'll get to it as quickly as we can. If it's a question for us on the information presented, once Liana's done speaking today, then we will read those questions aloud and answer as many as we can in the time allotted. So with that, let's get started. So for those of you who I've not had the pleasure of meeting previously, my name is Cami McElhenney, and I'm NACOL's Director of Training and Education. I joined the organization in 1998. I served as a civilian review board member in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I did so for about 6 years. I was very fortunate in that one of the founders of NACOL was the executive director of that oversight agency and helped me to understand the benefits of the organization and the reach that it could have. And so since 1998, I have helped the organization first as a volunteer, then as a contractor, and now as a full-time employee. Throughout the year, I put programs together like this. I'm responsible for putting together and producing the annual conference, but I also, when we're not having pandemics, I also put together regional trainings throughout the country. Liana, would you like to introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm talking to you today from Arizona, so it's still early afternoon for me. I've been a member of NACOL since actually 1997 when I became the independent police auditor for the city of Tucson. I've been actively involved in NACOL since that time. I was the auditor until 2014, and when I retired, I basically turned over a different chapter in my life and went to work for NACOL as a contractor and have been doing that work ever since. It's very gratifying work to help and assist our current members and our interested members and communities from all over the country in this quest that we all seem to be on with respect to getting as much information and materials necessary to be effective oversight professionals in our community. So happy to be with you tonight. Hopefully we can answer your questions and provide some meaningful resources for you.
Thanks, Liana. So let's just jump right in since we don't have probably as much time as we'd want this evening. So I'd like to start all of our presentations on civilian oversight with this information. So as you all know, otherwise you wouldn't probably be on this webinar today, there is a lot that is needed to be done to not only policing, but also the criminal justice system as a whole, to make it more equitable, more transparent, more accountable. And a lot of times, particularly when there is a crisis in a community that is related to a police action, a lot of times people will just say, all we need civilian oversight, and with maybe this or that, and everything will be solved. I think it's really important to start with understanding that civilian oversight alone is not going to solve all of the problems. However, without it, it's difficult, if not impossible, for reform to occur. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why that is as we move along today. So let's start with a basic definition of civilian oversight. So civilian oversight is the process of investigating, auditing, reviewing internal affairs, and law enforcement investigations or processes, including community complaints and use of force incidents. It also sometimes involves conducting ongoing monitoring of law enforcement agencies, including their policies, their training, procedures, supervision practices. And one of the most important parts of this is that these first 2 points are done by non-sworn law enforcement. Civilian oversight, although we see that some of the first oversight entities in the country started in the 1920s, they rarely had very much authority at the beginning, and really when they were established, rarely lasted very long. It wasn't until really the 1940s that we started seeing things that resemble what we now know as civilian oversight, and not until the 1970s that we start to see oversight agencies that were established through legislation that have been able to stand the test of time. But something that's important to remember is that civilian oversight has often been seen as a reactive process. So not only in its formation, and by that I mean often civilian oversight entities are created after high-profile incident or scandal in a particular community, but also in the work that they do, it tends to be reactive. They respond to individual complaints. They have traditionally reviewed policies only because they received one or more complaints related to those policies. It has tended to emphasize legalistic rules. It is an administrative process that is often seen as adversarial, and sometimes adversarial from both sides, not only from law enforcement, but sometimes also from the community. It recommends sanctions for individual officers, and it relies on deterrence. However, what we've seen in recent years is that it's becoming more proactive. As I mentioned at the very onset, we have communities all over the country who are contacting us that haven't had that critical incident yet, and they want to make sure that they have something in place that can help build those bridges and create an environment where there can be transparency and accountability before a critical incident happens and tears their community apart. But also, oversight has really worked to become more of a proactive process. Now we see oversight agencies exploring problems proactively, whether that's through data collection and analysis or investigation. It also works to identify underlying issues and causes. It focuses on organizational change rather than focusing on those individual incidents of misconduct. It concentrates on the reduction and prevention of the misconduct. It works very hard to build partnerships with law enforcement and community so that they then can create a bridge between law enforcement and the greater community. So just a few facts about the field. So we know that there are about 166 active civilian oversight entities across the United States at this time. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about civilian or community advisory boards that are not enabled through legislation. These are oversight agencies who are either formed through an ordinance or are part of a city charter, that they have authority and staff. Something to remember about civilian oversight, and when Liana speaks later, you'll understand why a little bit more. No two civilian oversight entities in the United States or around the world are exactly the same. They tend to mold to the needs of the community, and so because of that, it's almost like a pick and choose to see what will work best for that community, and that's how they're created. Most large cities and large law enforcement agencies have oversight agencies, but it's not just the San Franciscos, the Chicagos, the Miamis anymore. It is also smaller cities, mid-sized cities like Indianapolis, St. Louis, but you also have small cities. We've been working prior to the events that we see now, we've been working with smaller cities like Athens, Georgia, Charlottesville, to help establish oversight in those communities as well. And I think it's also important to say that in the last decade, we've also seen that civilian oversight has been prominently featured in Department of Justice settlement agreements. So there are cities such as Seattle and New Orleans their police departments were under consent decree. Civilian oversight was part of the process that needed to be followed in the reform efforts. So why is oversight necessary? So I feel certain that everybody on this webinar probably could list these things out, but protects human rights, promotes constitutional policing, increases public confidence and trust in the police, builds that bridge between law enforcement and the public that we discussed before, and it supports effective policing. One of the benefits of civilian oversight is that if you're able to build the bridge between community and law enforcement, it actually helps law enforcement do their job in a more effective and likely safer manner, because they have the relationship with the community needed to do effective policing. It ensures greater accountability, and it also enhances risk management. There are cities that do turn to civilian oversight because of research that says that there is a correlation with decrease in payments out from cities and civilian oversight. So some of these things, as you're working in your cities to establish oversight, or if you have oversight and are looking to enhance it, some of these things are great things to bring up with some of your stakeholders as you're trying to get their support. So common goals of oversight. So once you've established oversight, there are things that oversight, no matter what your agency looks like, strives for. And before I mention everything in my bullet points here, I think one of the most important goals is that civilian oversight holds itself up to the same standards that it's asking of law enforcement, so that oversight is done in a fair, transparent, and accountable manner. But in addition to that, oversight strives to ensure that police complaint process is accessible to everyone, that there are no barriers, so that you have ways to file complaints in person in a way that doesn't seem intimidating to individuals, that there's online mechanisms. Some oversight agencies have apps where people can easily file complaints, and also your willingness to take anonymous complaints. Now, anonymous complaints are difficult because if you don't have a lot of information, it's very difficult to investigate complaints. But people who are there to make an accusation of misconduct may have fear of retribution, and so being able to file that anonymous complaint can really make the difference for them. Another goal is that to ensure that investigations are fair and thorough, and that findings are reasonable and discipline is appropriate. To improve public confidence in the police, to enhance the transparency of police organizations by reporting, and also not only reporting on what's been happening, the types of complaints they're getting, how they're being resolved, but also reporting on the work of the Civilian Oversight Agency. Some other goals are improving the policies and practices, as well as the training and management of law enforcement agencies. And this is often done through analyzing data and patterns that they see in that data. And in many instances, we hope that it deters officers from engaging in misconduct through the creation of more effective and consistent investigation processes, and also disciplinary processes. So there are very few oversight agencies in the country who actually have the authority to impose discipline. There are more that have the authority to recommend discipline. But one of the things that, particularly in an auditor or monitor model, and if you don't know what those are, don't worry, we're going to talk about that too. One of the things that happens in those models often is an audit of how discipline is being doled out within a law enforcement agency. It also reduces legal liability associated with with officer misconduct. And something very important, it improves the public's understanding of police policy, training, and practices. You know, a lot of times when there are interactions and misconduct that is brought to light through the complaint process, of course, some of it is very serious, but I think that most oversight agencies would tell you that a great amount of the complaints that they receive have to do with people not fully understanding what the general orders are of the officer. And on the other side of that, often they are complaints that have to do with rude and discourteous behavior. And so that's also why we see a lot of oversight agencies having mediation programs, so that not only can the complaint be brought to light and investigated, but there's also that chance before that investigation even happens for a member of the community and the officer to sit down and have a conversation and come to an understanding and better understand each other. And so we see a lot of success in some cities who've implemented mediation, and that's cities really of all sizes who have had success with that. So next I want to talk a little bit about the 13 principles for effective civilian oversight. So as we move on and civilian oversight continues to grow and professionalize in the way that it does the day-to-day work, NACOL recently put together 13 principles that it believes that when followed make for more effective and sustainable oversight. Now, because, remember I said earlier, there are no two entities that are the same, you will see some of these principles maybe elevated in some cities, but really you find aspects of them in every agency that is doing good and effective work. So I just wanted to go over these quickly with you. We could probably spend an entire hour just talking about these, but just to give you a little bit more information about them. So the first principle is independence. And so independence deals with the absence of real or perceived influence by law enforcement, political actors, special interest groups from the work that's being done. For civilian oversight to be effective, it really needs to be seen as independent from all of those entities so that it can do fair and adequate or accurate work. Secondly, we have a clearly defined and adequate jurisdiction and authority. So having that adequate jurisdiction and authority is fundamental in achieving organizational goals and ensuring that oversight agencies can be responsive to communities. The agencies need to have enough authority to successfully perform its duties to the greatest degree possible without limitation. And really, without that adequate jurisdiction and authority, you're setting up oversight entities to fail. The next principle is unfettered access to records and facilities. So particularly in agencies who do their own independent investigations or auditor or monitor models that need data from the law enforcement agency so that they can do those monitoring or those reports and the data analysis, they need to be able to have quick and easy access to the information that's needed to do that work. In addition, those jurisdictions that who do jail and prison oversight also need to have easy and unfettered access to facilities to be able to see what's going on inside of them. The fourth principle is access to law enforcement executives and internal affairs staff. So the ability to effectively communicate with law enforcement officials regarding matters of concern is essential. If you don't have that kind of relationship and are able to have those conversations, really the work that you're doing is falling on deaf ears and you're not really making much progress. Another thing to think about in that, when you're creating civilian oversight, those entities that have something in their operating procedures where if they're making recommendations that law enforcement officials must respond to them within a certain amount of time and respond to their recommendations in writing, really makes for a more effective process on both ends. That way, you know that recommendations aren't sitting on someone's desk languishing when they could be doing well or doing making things better as far as policies are concerned. But also, if there is something that, for instance, the chief does not agree to, it's important that not only the oversight agency, but the community at large understand why the chief didn't agree with that, or internal affairs staff. Because once that explanation is out there, it might make perfect sense, but if it's not, people will just wonder. So it's also talks to the transparency that needs to be there. And so along with that is full cooperation. In order to do its work, civilian oversight has to have full cooperation from law enforcement staff and executives. Next, we have sustained stakeholder support. So support is really easy to find right after a critical incident. But unfortunately, particularly when we're talking about elected officials, sometimes once things clear a bit and it's not in the news every day, that sometimes that stakeholder support is a little harder to find or see on a daily basis. So it's important that a civilian oversight work to build relationships with the stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I'm talking about elected officials, law enforcement, executives, and also just line officers, academics, community members, journalists. All of those are stakeholders within a community that you need to have a relationship with so they know what you're doing and you can continue to move things forward. Next is adequate funding and resources, and I'm sure that you can all guess what this one means. There are many oversight entities that are, and actually I would say there's very few that are adequately funded and resourced at this point. Most of them are given large mandates without the budget or structure to carry out those mandates. So in order to make sure that the oversight agency is set up for success and sustainable effectiveness, you've got to have the adequate funding and resources to have the staff that's needed, to do the outreach that needs to be done, and very importantly, for them to have continuous training. It is amazing to me, and I know I'm a little partial to training, but it is amazing to me how many civilian oversight board members are not able to receive a full breadth of training. And by that I mean, and I'll just use an example from my experience on a civilian oversight board. In the ordinance that formed our board, we had mandated training, and that was 20 hours of training at the academy. And the topics of that training were decided upon kind of in a way that some things that we thought we needed more information on, things that the law enforcement agency thought we needed some more information on. And so it was very collaborative in that sense. We also did 16 hours of ride-alongs every year, and it was mandated for every member of the board. We were lucky in that we had a small training budget, so some of our board members were able to attend conferences and get additional training, but there was never enough money for all of them. And it's important that if you're going to have people do this work, whether as a paid staff member or a volunteer, that they know the information, they know things about policing, they know how civilian oversight should be conducted, they know what a good investigation looks like, and without that, you're really setting yourself up again for failure. The next principle is public reporting and transparency. So it is very important for civilian oversight to put out at least an annual report. And when I'm talking about at least an annual report, that's more geared towards the civilian oversight boards out there who might not have they're not doing extra policy work all the time. They're not doing independent investigations. So they're really putting information out there to let the public know the work they're doing and the types of complaints that they're seeing. But there are lots of oversight agencies out there who do more than that. They also do some do semi-annual reports, and lots of them do special reports, particularly those who are doing audits or monitoring law enforcement agencies. And these could be on a very specific topic, for instance, monitoring police or monitoring protests, or reporting of use of force. And so those types of reporting bring transparency to a process that for the public and the broader public is often, it's completely kind of a dark hole. People don't know what's going on in those areas. The other piece, next piece, is policy and pattern analysis. So analysis of policy and patterns has a great potential to advance the goals of civilian oversight by addressing systemic problems of law enforcement. So this is kind of back to that proactive piece that I spoke about before. Being able to look at those and do the analysis allows you to make recommendations for how things could change, policy amendments that could make law enforcement do their job in a better way. Next, we have community outreach and community involvement, and I'll talk about these together because it seems very much like they're the same thing, but the easiest way to explain it is community outreach is really how do you get your information out to the community? How do you make sure that they know that you're there, what your process is, to set up the expectations of what you are and are not able to do, and then also to make them know how that affects policing in your community and the work that you're doing, how that affects policing in your community, and also help them to better understand how that is moving things forward in the realm of law enforcement. Community involvement is more about bringing people in, getting volunteers, making sure that people understand how they can give input into the work that you're doing. So community outreach is going out there, letting people know what you're doing. Community involvement is more about getting input from the community to make sure you're addressing the issues that are important to the community. So that has to be an ongoing effort for any oversight agency. Our 12th principle is confidentiality, anonymity, and protection from retaliation. So stakeholders in the community have to be confident that civilian oversight entities are protecting sensitive information, as well as those who are disclosing it to them. Without that trust, they're not going to be able to do their job. Next, we have procedural justice and legitimacy. So research is, I'm sure most of you have heard about procedural justice. It is a word that comes up all of the time in civilian oversight and in law enforcement now. Research has shown that procedurally just interactions between law enforcement and the public positively impact the public's compliance with laws. And I'm sure you can understand the opposite of that, what happens when they are non-procedurally just interactions. But although there's less research to show this, there is some out there that talks about civilian oversight when it is a procedurally just complaint process. Complainants report being more satisfied with the quality of the communication and the process as a whole, and increases their satisfaction with the work that the civilian oversight agency is doing. So now quickly, before I turn it over to Liana, I just want to quickly talk about a framework for effective practices in civilian oversight. So a lot of times, and particularly when you're talking and working to establish civilian oversight, there is a lot of talk about what are the best practices. Well, we step back from best practices because civilian oversight, as it has grown, and this goes back to what I said earlier, there are very few civilian oversight entities that look identical to one another. And in addition, there is very little standardization in the data that's being collected from one to another. And a lot of that has to do with their different levels of authority that they have and the work that they're doing. So the goals of civilian oversight don't really lend themselves to comparative measurement. And so it is very difficult because of that to determine best practices. Because of that, we are moving towards an effective practices framework. So in the field like civilian oversight, it's important to remember that there are several possible paths to success. So when we're talking about effective practices, they allow flexibility and context to take into consideration the type of agency and its authority. Oversight takes into consideration the core values and principles that should be satisfied to produce better outcomes. And the diverse perspectives and wisdom of experienced practitioners should be valued. Those who have done it before, even though they may not be able to do everything they want given their authority structure that they've been given, I think we can learn a lot from those who have been doing the work, whether it's a short time or a long time, about what has worked in their situation given the structure that they're within. But also it's important that stakeholder input and dialogue has to be prioritized when we're talking about developing effective practices. So instead of looking at standardized data to determine best practices, we're taking all of these things to look at what's effective in civilian oversight. So when you're looking at recommendations for effective practices, it's important to say, is the practice an appropriate fit for our local context? And how will this practice strengthen civilian oversight in relation to the 13 principles that I spoke about earlier? And what are the potential unintended consequences of implementing this practice? There always has to be a moment where you look and say, okay, this seems like this will help right this moment with this problem. What other effects might it have, short-term and long-term? So with that, I realize I have gone over a tremendous amount of information very quickly. But that's why we have questions later. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Liana, to talk a little bit about civilian oversight structures.
Thank you, Kemi. And I just want to say up front that we did this presentation a couple of nights ago for a community group in a city in California, and we realized very quickly about an hour and a half into our presentation that we had way too many slides. We wanted to narrowly focus on what we felt was really important information to get out to all of you right now, recognizing that you will have questions, and by all means, please, follow up with us. I want to go over the oversight structures with respect to the range of authority, but there's also, the powers and the duties and the responsibilities of each of those types of models that we have material and resources on that I'd be happy to share with you if, those are the direction, that's the direction you want to go in your communities, or if you need that information to, further evaluate what type of model you may be considering for your community. So we're going to talk about the different structures. The recognized structures that are most common right now. But I want to make this point up front. It's a collaborative process. It's creating effective oversight bodies that are responsive to the needs. It takes time, it takes planning, collaboration, and transparent discussions amongst the affected stakeholders. I can't emphasize that enough. I've talked to, as Kemi mentioned, since June 1st, I've talked to over 75 communities in the country wanting to create oversight like yesterday. And the questions are always, which model is best? We want the best model. And I'm like, take your time. Don't take forever. I mean, don't take months on end, but take your time and be very strategic and inclusive in discussing the model that may best serve the needs for your community. So it does take time, and it is a deliberative process, but you will get to where you need to be if you take all the various perspectives of your stakeholders into account. Next. So there's really 4 different models of oversight that we pretty much recognize. There's the review focus model, the monitoring auditing focus model, there's the investigative model, and there's hybrid models, which are usually seen as a combination of 1 or 2 and sometimes even more of the other models combined. And each one has its kind of pros and cons and are structured a little bit differently, but we'll talk about each one of those. So the review focus model is really the model that is looking at the actions or the investigations after the fact. So it's a model that is usually very inclusive of the community, because these are usually your community review boards or citizen review boards, whatever they are titled. But these type of models ensure that the community has the ability to provide input into the investigation process by reviewing the thoroughness and accuracy of the investigations that usually, or well, almost all the time, are actually being investigated by the law enforcement agencies' internal affairs offices. These models have a high level, or the ability to actually create that high level of increased public trust in the process, because it's really members of the community, either volunteered or paid, that are sitting on these boards reviewing these investigations. So they can oftentimes have the ability to agree or disagree with the findings and even the recommendations for discipline that come out of the Office of, what I call it, Office of Professional Standards, that's what it's called here in Tucson, but of the Internal Affairs divisions. So there's a lot of community involvement. Some of these boards actually consist of, as little as 3 people, but up to, I mean, we've seen some boards that are like pretty big, like 14, 15 community members that are part of these boards. So the range of authority for the review focus model is, they can also receive complaints sometimes and refer them to the law enforcement agency for the investigation. So remember, as a review focus model, they don't have investigative authority, so they're relying on the law enforcement agency to actually do the investigations. The professional staff of the review boards can also either directly from the, usually the boards have like an elected chairperson or a committee, a review committee, however it's structured, to actually relay information about the completed investigations with respect to any kind of feedback back to the law enforcement agency. In other words, they can, the next bullet says they can remand it back to the internal affairs for further investigation if they feel that a piece of evidence wasn't collected, or there was a witness that was identified but no efforts were made to locate that witness that may have been crucial to the actual investigation. They can send it back for further investigation as necessary. Oftentimes they can review the case disposition, they can review the discipline, and they can also review any kind of departmental changes or revisions to departmental policies and procedures that come out as a result of an investigation. They can hear appeals from complainants or subject officers. I spoke to a city yesterday. It's actually one of the largest cities in the Midwest that has had an oversight agency for a long time, and their board actually, this is basically all the board does, is when a citizen disagrees with the finding of the Internal Affairs Division, they can file appeals with this board, and so the board is tasked with reviewing those appeals and determining if they warrant, the investigation warrants further attention. Holding public forums. So this is where the community boards really do a lot of their community engagement responsibilities with the public forums, and it's not necessarily just for individual, complainants to come and address the board about their circumstances or their complaints, but sometimes it's more general and basic in nature. If there's like an overall issue that perhaps the community is seeing with respect to how law enforcement is policing their community or a particular incident, the public forums are very good to gather information for the review for the board. The community outreach can be conducted by staff and or review board members. Some of these boards have, even some of the very larger ones, are volunteers. The boards members themselves are volunteers, but sometimes they are paired with actual paid staff from the city or county organization that actually help. They're either like executive officers or executive directors that assist the board with their work by providing them the materials and resources necessary to do their reviews or also engage in the community outreach. And they hold public meetings in accordance with state laws and union contracts. So we put that in there because, like Cami said at the beginning of this, no two entities are created equally, and a lot of that has to do with state law, because in some states in the public meeting environment, you cannot make a reference to specific incidents or specific information about officers. So the way these are structured need to be very considerate of what the board itself will and will not be able to do in accordance with public law, state or local laws. So that is sometimes an impediment to some of the work that they do with respect to their public meetings, but it's something that is definitely there. But there are ways to be effective, even with some of these apparent restrictions, but there is still ways for the boards to be effective. So the investigative focus model, this is the one that is very resource intensive because you are doing, when I'm saying you as the investigative agency of the oversight agency are doing all of the work. So this has its pros and cons. Obviously, resource intensive in that you have to have full-time, investigators and rather large staff. You have, depending on the size of the agency, you have to be appropriately resourced. This model is looked at as the one that probably is the one that has the highest level of being able to reduce the bias or perceived biases of investigations into citizen complaints, because the investigations are being completed entirely by individuals outside of the police department. So they are non-law enforcement investigators in entity that's separate and apart from the police department. The full-time investigators need to have highly specialized training. They have to have a lot of training because they are doing the investigations from start to finish. They don't rely on any of the investigators or information from the police department, but they do need to have access to all of the information, such as the statements of the witnesses, any kind of the police reports, radio transmissions, body-worn camera. That's a huge one for the investigative focus model, because they need to have access to all of that information to do a thorough investigation. So these are, the investigative model seems to be the one that is, perceived to be the strongest, because they are civilian-led investigations from start to finish. So they are the ones that are perceived to increase that level of community trust because of its complete outside entity doing those investigations. Again, just to reiterate, they're employing professionally trained staff to conduct the investigations. They can replace the critical functions of a standard internal affairs unit altogether. If all your complaints are going to a separate and independent model and oversight model that is completely staffed to do investigations, the need for some of these internal affairs divisions that are just doing, citizen complaints and investigations can almost be eliminated in some cases. They often have investigative jurisdiction only over certain types of allegations. Sometimes that is based upon the sheer volume of complaints that they are getting in. There's some agencies that will only have the authority to investigate use of force or high profile types of complaints, and not maybe some of the more standard, perhaps rudeness, attitude, or failure to investigate or provide appropriate service. They usually some of them have only the authority to investigate some of the higher profile types of complaints and more serious types of allegations. They have the ability to conduct the interviews of the witnesses, including the civilian witnesses and police officers. They gather evidence. When I say this investigative model, they prepare the investigative reports. They can make the recommendations for findings to ensure to determine whether the evidence is supporting the allegations. And in some complaints, and in some cases rather, and it's very rare, but in some cases, the oversight entity, under the investigative model, they have the authority to recommend and sometimes impose discipline, but it's very rare. There's very few investigative models out there that have that ability. So the auditor monitor focus model. So this, we like to think of this model kind of emerged more so in, I would say, the mid-90s, because when I became the auditor in the city of Tucson in 1997, I believe there was only one other auditor model operating in the city, in the country at that time. And so it was relatively new, but it's seemed as of late to get a lot more attention with respect to the role of auditors and monitors in the oversight structure. So this is oftentimes seen as kind of a compromise between having a fully investigative model and volunteer review models. You have authority and responsibilities to have more robust practices for reports, and making recommendations to promote systemic changes based on your ability to what you're seeing holistically as potential systemic problems within the department. So you're not necessarily conducting investigations, but you do have access to all the investigations. Similar to the review models, you're getting a little more information with respect to the ability to make recommendations that are supported by what you're seeing with respect to numbers of patterns and practices and trends. They tend to be a little less expensive than a full investigative model, but more expensive than when I say expensive, it's all relevant, right? So more resource intensive than just a volunteer board. So the city of Tucson basically had a hybrid model, the auditor, they still do, the auditor and a volunteer board as well. So this model also allows the agency to actively engage in many or all steps of the complaint process. The term monitor is sometimes used or written into the ordinance or the charter or the authority of the monitor, and that aspect allows you to monitor ongoing investigations, so you can observe the interviews of the witnesses or the officers, and in some cases you have the ability through that process to be able to interject questions and have your concerns as the monitor addressed at the time that the investigation is ongoing rather than after the fact once the investigation is completed. It's more efficient to do it in that manner, especially when you have an investigation that is multifaceted or has multiple witnesses and scenes or individuals that were affected, and it's more efficient to monitor the investigation ongoing rather than to send it back after the fact once it's already been either closed out and you're just reviewing and sending it back. To be able to interject at the time of the ongoing investigation is preferred. So the range of authority for the auditor monitor focus model, audit, monitor, investigate, they can review the wider range of policies, practices, procedures, One of the things that I use as an example many times that happened to me early on in my career was an incident, or we were receiving numerous complaints of officers using chokeholds. This is back in the mid-90s. And what we noticed from those complaints coming forward, that one of the common denominators was that the complaints against the officers, their badge numbers were very close in proximity, which indicated to me that they actually came from they were all part of the same recruit class. So when we did a little more research on our own, we determined that yes, all those officers were part of the same recruit class. They were trained on that particular on use of force and de-escalation, so forth, for that particular topic by an outside trainer, a trainer from another law enforcement agency that actually did authorize the use of chokeholds. So what we were able to do is make, you know, a policy recommendation, number one, that we don't use trainers from outside agencies, and basically we're able to bring back that whole recruit class and retrain them. So that was an issue that, you know, caught up front. It prevented complaints from happening further down the line. So, you know, having that ability to make, to review and those types of complaints and actually identify patterns was very helpful. Ensuring that the complaint investigations comply with established policies and procedures. The monitors also can involve themselves in, I talked about this as far as ongoing investigation by observing the interviews, asking questions, and overseeing the overall direction of the investigation. And when I say overseeing, basically inserting themselves as to what they would like, the auditor would like to see be addressed with respect to the investigation to make it thorough. We can also monitor the disciplinary process to ensure that it is fair and consistent, so that when discipline is being recommended and doled out at the department level, that it's consistent across the board, that it's not more severe or less based on the same type of infraction. The auditors and monitors oftentimes have the ability to do the complaint intake and complaint classification, and basically make recommendations regarding all aspects of the agency that come to their attention. And then there's also that critical piece of community engagement that the auditors and monitors actually play within the community. I would say that all these models, without that community engagement piece, are not effective, because you need to be out there in the community and providing as many or as many resources and the information to the community about accessibility to the complaint process and how it works. And then the hybrid models, just kind of quickly. So these are the ones that you kind of maybe take elements from one or more of the three different models. And maybe there are some hybrid models that we don't necessarily know completely about right now. But they were kind of developed to address the needs to talk about some of those state and local laws that I mentioned earlier that may be impediments for one particular model, but you're still trying to have that community input. Maybe you attach a board as an advisory board to your auditor, or under the investigative model, maybe you also have that community board as well. So sometimes the hybrid models are have what we've noticed are as come about as a modification from an existing oversight agency. I mentioned all the calls I've gotten over the last couple of weeks, and many are from agencies that have existed. Some of our oversight agencies have been in existence for 40 years and up, and many of them are at this point trying to, are reevaluating not only the effectiveness of their agency, but what are the things that maybe perhaps they are missing, and what can they take from perhaps other models to strengthen their effectiveness in the role that they play in oversight. So the hybrid models are becoming increasingly common. So similar to the others, they can also review the completed internal investigations, Sometimes there are some cities that have multiple agencies that we would consider hybrid models, such as, I don't know if anybody's on the call from Seattle, you know that you have multiple oversight mechanisms operating in your community. Some parts of it are as a result of the federal consent decrees, but in some cities we do have multiple levels of the oversight agencies operating. And they're, you know, mostly professional staff who receive, you know, the input and feedback from boards or commissions, you know, representing the community, and can also evaluate the oversight entity or the entities in place. So the hybrid models sometimes have those boards attached to them, like I said, that are serving as maybe the evaluator, if you will, of the effectiveness of the other model that they are attached to. I know in some communities, the board actually has the authority to conduct the performance evaluation of perhaps the auditor or monitor that's in place. So it's kind of another check and balance in the system to ensure that everybody's doing and operating under their specified mandate for providing oversight. So this one, I think this is probably around the last slide. You know, this is something that we look to when we're advising communities on what models they may want to consider. These are some of the questions you should ask yourself. You know, what are the challenges that the agency is going to need to address right now? And so obviously in the last several weeks, we know there's probably some things that have not been priorities for the oversight agency that are now all of a sudden priorities. So what are you going to need to address right away? What challenges will there be in the near term, or are they going to be ongoing? Are there going to be things that, you know, changes to policies and practices and how you provide these essential, you know, this essential service of oversight? And most of it, I would suggest to you would be, you know, a long-term challenges, and what opportunities exist for the agency to advance the mission and provide the effective oversight. I think right now we're at an opportune time for, with all the conversation going on, for oversight agencies to basically get those added resources, get that added staffing, make changes to their existing ordinances or city charters, rather, to give themselves the authority and also, you know, the tools that they need to be more effective.
So thank you, Liana. And I apologize, Liana and I someday are going to be able to get the right number of slides in for the right amount of time, but there's so much information that we want to get to you that it's really hard for us to decide what can be cut and what can't. But if there's anything, even the information we gave today, if you have any questions about it, we went through it very quickly. A lot of it was a broad overview. So if you have any questions, just follow up with us afterwards. We're available to answer those. But we do have time for a couple of questions that we'll try to get to today. I do see several that have to do specifically with, will these slides be available afterwards? And yes, they will. We will, shortly after this, at least by tomorrow, we will send out a PDF version of these slides so that you have them. I also noticed that someone talked about how they were particularly excited about those 13 principles as talking points. And I'm pretty excited about those 13 principles too. They actually came out of a project that we did through a community policing development grant through the Department of Justice that we received at the end of 2015. That project has been ongoing and has many different parts to it, but one of them is a report on the state of civilian oversight and effective practices in civilian oversight of law enforcement. We are hoping that that will be published in August, and so that will be a great opportunity for everybody to have these types of things in one place. It has a great extensive history of civilian oversight, the 13 principles. The second half of the report is all effective practices, knowing that it probably just touches just the tip of the different effective practices that are out there, but it's definitely a great starting place. And then also, some of you who might want some more information on the models, on our website, if you haven't already found it, if you go to the resources tab and go down, there is a reports and publications section there that has two reports that were done through NACOL about the different models, and includes some additional information on strengths and weaknesses. One of those is called Assessing the Evidence, and I think that's the larger of the two publications. And then there is a shorter version that does just kind of give the basics about civilian oversight. So those should be very helpful to all of you looking for some more information there. Some of the other questions we got, the first one, I believe that it's already been answered in Liana's presentation, but the question of, are there cities that have both auditor and a civilian oversight board? And the answer is yes. The city that Liana previously worked in is one of those. So we can also, if you're looking at particular models, please let Liana and I know, and we can give you some examples of that type of model or hybrid that might already exist, so that you might not have to start from scratch, that you can get some examples. Next, Liana, I'm going to pass this question to you.
Sure.
A member of our Board of Supervisors is asking why we need another oversight board when the elected officials are already overseeing the police. Can you articulate the reasons, please?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, and from having experience working in a community, obviously with elected officials that sometimes get overwhelmed with the complaints, the day-to-day complaints that are referred to them, I think it's just another check and balance in the system that the oversight entity exists. Oftentimes it's there for, I mean, it helps the elected officials by, they don't want to get involved in the day-to-day complaints. They don't have the staffing, they don't have the resources, and they're not in there doing the work that the oversight agency is, to be able to identify patterns and practices that may be seen or collected and evaluated by using data and having the bigger picture in mind. So that elected official may only get, you know, 1 or 2 complaints from a certain constituent and think there's no issue. Oftentimes, also there may be reluctance by individuals that don't trust the process of taking a complaint directly to an elected official, and would have much more confidence in an entity that actually has the specific responsibility for oversight.
And then we'll wrap it up with one more question here. And again, if you post a question and we were not able to get to it, we will send you an email as a follow-up to try and answer your question. But the last one is, how do you recommend civilian groups get started who just want to learn more about the police policies and practices without having official oversight? Liana, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a conversation with your, I mean, hopefully you have a law enforcement agency that, and throughout, you know, all the way up to the chief, that is cooperative with information. I think they, for the most part, most law enforcement agencies like to share to an extent as much as possible that they can, their, you know, operations, and, you know, how do they respond to domestic violence calls? How do they, you know, what resources do they have to you know, to de-escalate situations and with different populations. So I think you just approach your law enforcement agency and maybe ask, you know, for additional information. Many law enforcement agencies have like citizen police academies, which are specifically for that reason. Sometimes they're 3 or 4 weeks in length, but they do highlight some of the work of the law enforcement agency, and, you know, the reasons for some of their policies and practices can be shared through those police academies, citizen police academies.
Thanks, Liana, for taking that. And thank you. We are, sorry, we're past the hour, and we do have some more questions, but Liana and I will take some time maybe before our next presentation of this to get to those few that we were not able to get to tonight. I just want to thank all of you for taking time. I think Learning more about this process is going to be so helpful in establishing oversight that is going to be sustainable and effective and actually carry out what you're hoping that it will be able to accomplish. So thank you for joining us. Please feel free to contact us with any additional questions, and we hope to see you online again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.